Okay, I moved outside here. I don't think the wind is too bad. Okay, so we have a couple moments of showing versus telling. One is that Grady tells us about Emily. He doesn't show us. A couple of you noticed that, and for me, that was a clear, glaring absence in the narrative. I think part of the reason for that is because Grady doesn't trust us, right? He doesn't trust the reader to make up our own mind as he's telling us the story. And this is why showing versus telling is important, right? Showing versus telling is important for us to recognize as writers because we need to trust our reader enough to make observations for themselves. We need to show them what's happening so that they can look at that and be like, oh, that character is kind of hesitant. Oh, that character is kind of rude. Oh, that character is being vulnerable. It doesn't mean as much when the writer tells us that that character is being hesitant or rude or vulnerable. It's all up for interpretation. So showing versus telling is really important to master because we as writers need to allow and to trust our reader enough to make up their own mind. You can guarantee that Michael Chabon knows the difference. You can guarantee that Michael Chabon, writing a character who teaches creative writing, is using that, right? So he tells us about Emily. He doesn't show us because Grady doesn't trust us. Grady tells us that he is envious of Crabtree's relationship with James, but we don't see it. I think it was Daniel who said that. I don't think that they have a relationship, right? So again, this is classic unreliable narrator. Two of you picked up on the fact that Crabtree probably raped James. If he didn't rape him, then it's definitely still an unhealthy relationship. I think there's a B on me. It's an unhealthy relationship. And Grady's envious of that. So what we see here is unreliable narrator. Grady is, because he's morally bankrupt, he is attracted to these very terrible moral things. And it's sad for us because we can see that clear disparity. And you know, we keep asking these questions as to why he's making these bad choices. Keep in mind that every story needs to have conflict, and every story needs to have some kind of, like, we're rooting for the character. And for some of you, you didn't like Grady and you weren't rooting for him, and that's fine. But we need to write stories where conflict happens because we as readers don't like stories about happy people in happy land. I've said that a lot. I'm going to keep saying it. We don't like stories about happy people in a happy land. And this certainly is not a story about a happy person in a happy land. And then two more comments before I jump into the book. One is Passover scene is one of my absolute favorites. And the reason that the Passover scene is so interesting is, here we have Grady, who is a morally bankrupt character. We have Grady, who has no nurturing influence in his life. We have Grady, who carries a lot of baggage with himself, and we have him in this Passover scene where he is connected to family. It's not his family, and therein is the disconnect again, right? He wants to be connected to a family, and so he sees this family interacting and like nurturing each other and being part of each other's life and having community and having fellowship, and he genuinely wants that. But he is an outsider looking in. He doesn't know how to achieve that. And what's really interesting in that scene is we're very aware of Marie, who is also an outsider. In fact, he says that at some point her Jewishness supersedes everyone else's inherited Jewishness. This outsider becomes so Jewish and so committed to the family cohort that she invests her whole life into it. And she is more Jewish than the rest. So he can see that it's possible for an outsider to learn the details and to come in, but he doesn't know how to do that, which is kind of a shame because we do see that disconnect and we see somebody who is so removed from everyone else. And then the second comment I have is a couple of you looked at the movie. And what's interesting is for those of you who looked at the movie and didn't like it, I want to explain kind of a little bit why. The book, and indeed all written fiction, has something called internal landscape, that there's so much happening with the character that like their thoughts and kind of like their memories, that it's really difficult to translate that to film. I tend to like the movie, but I like the movie as something different from the book, because the book does have so many interesting descriptions that the movie just can't convey, because even though we have a narrator voice from the Michael Douglas narrator, it's just not the same. So something to keep in mind. Okay, so a couple things about the book. One thing I really enjoy in this book is description. Page 8, he was looking at me as though I were a monster he'd created with his own brain and hands, and he were about to throw the switch that would send me reeling spasmodically across the countryside, laying waste to rude farmsteads and despoiling the rural maidenry. Right? Like, this is on page 8. So already by page 8, it was like, okay, these descriptions are going to be good. On page 12, I think it's really funny that his draft was exactly 2,611 pages. One of you, and I don't remember who it was, drew the comparison to George R.R. Martin in Game of Thrones, who, he's been working on his manuscript forever. The thing with writers is that we often want to call ourselves writers. We want to say that we're working on a project, but we don't like to admit failure with a project. And so that's what we see here in Grady. That's what I wonder is happening. And I don't know, but I'm wondering if it's happening with George R.R. Martin, somebody who has seen success, right? And as long as the project is coming, there's hope. But if the project has come and it's maybe not as successful as he had hoped, there's failure in that. That's what happens with Grady, right? He's kicking the can down the road. As long as the novel is coming, there's hope, but he is afraid of disappointing. Page 19 is the description of the midnight disease. It was in this man's class that I first began to wonder if people who wrote fiction were not suffering from some kind of disorder. Right. And then we wonder, of course, about James, who is somebody who is trying on these lives. Page 21, I stayed up all night long at the typewriter for the week before my story was due, drinking bourbon and trying to untangle the terrible symbolical mess I had made out of a simple story my grandmother once told me about a mean black rooster that had killed her dog when she was a little girl. Again, we do that, right? When we pick at a story and we pick at it, we create a mess out of it. That's why revision is so hard. Page 34, we have another good description. And this is also in relationship to how he views women. He says, undressing her was an act of recklessness, a kind of vandalism, like releasing a zoo full of animals or blowing up a dam. Right? So he views women as women who need to be caged, or women who need to be like carefully manicured or carefully held together. He sees women as these structures, right? And so I think that speaks to his insecurity, that he doesn't feel like he's good enough to approach a woman as an equal. I love this description of Sarah on page 39. The other explanation I used to make to myself was that my lover was an addict and I was a manufacturer of her particular drug of choice. I love that. I love that she would be described like he is an addict with really unhealthy behaviors and addictions, but she is an addict for books. Like, I just love that idea. And I love that he is, manufacturing her drug of choice. I also feel like that makes her different. Like, she is a positive, or can be a positive influence in his life. Reading to her, this is page 40, reading to her was a kind of pyromania. Love that description. And then another description of her on page 45. This didn't seem likely, given the chancellor of a college was among the last people in America required to build a career out of such outmoded materials as probity and temperance and good repute. And this is that question, like, why is she with him then? Page 57 is the list of all of the actors or famous people or creatives who committed suicide. On the one hand, it's really interesting in terms of story that a character would have all these things memorized and rote. It's also a really sad commentary on how we glorify suicide in some cases. I think we need to destigmatize mental illness, but I don't think we should glorify suicide ever. And then I skipped a bit because this seems like the middle is a lot of dragon slaying. Which is an expression for, like, going out and accomplishing something, and then you go out and accomplish something else, and then you go out and accomplish something else, right? So it's a lot of dragon slaying. Page 234, this was really interesting to me. This was the writer's true doppelganger, I thought. Not some invisible imp of the perverse who watched you from the shadows, periodically appearing, dressed in your clothes and carrying your house keys to set fire to your life, but rather the typical protagonist of your work, Roderick Usher, Eric Waldeness, Francis Maycomer, Dick Diver, whose narratives at first reflected, but in time came to determine your life's very course. So he's saying that writers create, like, we create doppelgangers for ourselves, right? And again, this is about this idea. We like the idea of being a writer. I think actually it was George R.R. Martin too who said, I don't like being a writer, I like having written, right? And he's saying that here. And also, like, true, professor in college form, the four names he listed are characters. Roderick Usher is the most well-known to me. Roderick Usher being an Edgar Allan Poe reference, somebody who was like almost vampiric in quality, right? So again, like, he's creating emotional distance by referencing things that we may not be aware of. But he's also conveying who he is as a character in his voice, right? By referencing those, like, literary references. I mean, a professor would do that. Page 249. This is also interesting to me. It's kind of carrying this doppelganger theory. It was a brazen, ridiculous, thrilling performance with the ballast of genuine sadness that kept the whole thing from keeling over in the gale force winds of melodrama, whether because he had outgrown them, forgotten them, or finally tired of hearing me and his peers complain about them. James had largely abandoned his silly experiments with syntax and punctuation, and the prose throughout, although quirky and clotted with similes, did a good job of persuading, at least for the duration of each sentence and paragraph, that the events therein described really had come to pass. What's interesting to me about this is he's talking about James Lear's writing. And his criticisms are that they're quirky and clotted with similes, which is exactly how Grady has been telling the story. So his criticisms of James are what he himself is guilty of. I think that's very human. We do that a lot. Like, the things that we're critical in other people are the things that we do ourselves. This was an interesting quote. 252. I tried to shake the feeling that of all the people I had broken faith with in my life, James Lear was the one least able to withstand the betrayal. So who was it? Carla said that that James becomes the protagonist at some point. And then we also see from Amanda that Grady seems to care more about James than anybody else. I think it's because he sees James as fragile. I don't necessarily think James is fragile, but he sees James as fragile. Page 302. There were, I was suddenly certain, a lot of things about Wonder Boys that had never occurred to me. On a certain crucial level, how strange, I had no idea of what the book was really about, and not the faintest notion of how it would strike the reader. Also relatable. We as writers, especially in a novel writing class, I feel like I need to tell you this. At some point, people will ask you what your novel's about, and you have to find a 30-second pitch but you have been writing for so long and have created so many different ideas that it's really difficult to just stop and be like, okay, in 30 seconds, here it is, right? Like you've created these themes and these characters and these people. I mean, even just to look at a finished draft and for people to ask you what the book's about and then you summarize it for them. I feel like oversimplification is immaturity. So if you say that this book is just about, then it's a really immature oversimplification. So we want to be mature and we want to be accurate, right? And how do we also summarize a book, our own book, even in 30 seconds? Difficult. This becomes especially present on page 314 when he talks about revision, which we have been talking about this week. Great, said Crabtree. Look, Trip, just give me a couple of months, all right? Take a couple more months. Take a year. Pare it down. Finish the thing. I'll be in a much better position to help you, when you're really done. A couple of months. I felt no sense of relief at finally being granted the reprieve I've dreamt of for so many weeks. The promise had a weak, bureaucratic ring to it, and anyway, pare it down? How would I know what to pare down when I wasn't even sure anymore what the whole thing was about? Revision sucks. I love you. I'm here for you. I will help you. But revision is painful and awful and frustrating and confusing, and you have to walk away from it and then come back. And that's the truth of it. But no writer can possibly write a good first draft, right? You have to write a crappy first draft, which I think it was Angela who said that in the post from this last week. It's really okay to write a crappy first draft. You're supposed to. You're intended to. It needs to be crappy. And guess what? Some of you think like, oh, I'm so brilliant. I'm just so brilliant. I wrote a perfect first draft. No such thing. There really is no such thing. Like real good drafts need to be retooled and retooled and retooled. And revision's just not fun, but everybody needs to do it. And then last thing I want to talk about from the book is page 326. This is an interesting quote to me. All male friendships are essentially quixotic. They last only so long as each man is willing to polish the shaving bowl helmet, climb on his donkey, and ride off after the other in pursuit of elusive glory and questionable adventure. Of course, that's a Don Quixote reference, which again is characterization because he's a professor referencing a literary work. But also I think it's really funny that of all the literary works he could have picked, he picked Don Quixote. So kind of interesting. All right, my dears, I hope this has helped to kind of discuss the story a little bit. Hopefully you can see kind of a little bit more characterization and plotting. Hopefully some of the comments that I pulled out resonated with you. Ultimately, I do think it's a really good book. I mean, it's not perfect. It definitely has its tone, and there's no accounting for taste. Either you liked it or you didn't. But I do hope that you saw some value in it, at least as a writer. Of course, I thought I was being pretty clever in a novel writing class to pick a novel about a novelist who's unsuccessfully writing a novel. So, that was kind of funny. So hopefully it was like a how not to do manual as much as it was, like in terms of story as like, and then you got some value in it in terms of story structure. So, all right, my dears, have a good one. Keep up the good work.